We are honored to have with us an expert on Egyptian politics, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. With all the news going on about Syria right now, people have forgotten that there's also a crisis going on in Egypt simultaneously. Although our congressional delegation, including Michelle Bachmann, reminded us of that yesterday. She told us that it was the Muslim Brotherhood who attacked us on 9/11. So hopefully Larry will be able to sort that out for us during this time. I'm sure it was. Let me introduce our guest. Larry Pintak is the Dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communications here at WSU. He's a veteran of more than 30 years in journalism on 4 different continents. He now writes and lectures on American relationship to the Muslim world and on the role of media in shaping global perceptions and on government policy. Larry holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Wales. Prior to coming to WSU, he served as the director of the Kamal Adams Center for Journalism at the American University in Cairo. As a former CBS News Middle East correspondent, Larry reported on the birth of the modern suicide bombing in the Middle East, and on the Iran-Iraq War, and on the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Larry also covered the Indonesian Revolution, and I assume that's the 1998, not the 1945.
Right, and that was the one that involved the brother.
Oh, good, okay. He covered that revolution for ABC News and for the San Francisco Chronicle. His latest book is entitled The New Arab Journalist, Mission and Identity in a Time of Turmoil. Join me now and welcome you to Larry Pintak.
No PowerPoints, no speech to read, etc. I just thought we'd kind of talk about things a little bit today. So, who wants to talk about Egypt? One person. Who wants to talk about Syria? Inseparable. The reality is that what we're seeing in the Arab world today is probably the most seminal moment in the last 40 years or so. While the Muslim Brotherhood may not have been responsible for 9/11, though I guess they're still checking on that up on the Hill, all of these things are interlinked. And we're seeing a moment where the Arab world is shifting from that brief Arab Spring back to a very deep Arab winter, and really racking back 20 years in terms of the divisions within the region. If you look at, certainly Egypt is overtly the issue at the moment of the Brotherhood versus essentially the army and the old Mubarak Guard, but it's more complicated than that. But at a fundamental level, that is the critical Islamists versus what is becoming an almost rabid Egyptian nationalism that's reemerging. But those same forces in various iterations are playing out in other parts of the region. And the reason that Egypt is so critical is because it has always been the leader of the Arab world, while the Saudis might like to think they are, in kind of cultural and psychological terms. Egypt has really been the dominant force in the Arab world for a long time. If you go back into Egyptian modern history, and I'm sure we have a few Egyptians here, they'll tell you that this confrontation now, that is essentially between the Brotherhood and the military, is exactly the confrontation that we had back in the late 50s, early 60s in Egypt, and has been repeated at various times. For those who don't know the history, and there's no reason you should have very much knowledge of Egyptian history. Yeah, there's the pyramids and the pharaohs and all that, but I'm talking more recent. It was the army in partnership with the Brotherhood that overthrew King Farouk and created the modern Egyptian state. I won't say democratic state, but the modern Egyptian state. And through history, both in Egypt and around the region, we see this cyclical relationship between forces of the military, forces of authoritarianism, forces of nationalism, and the forces of Islamism, political Islam. At times being allies, having a common enemy, and at times being enemies. So in Egypt, they were allies in the fight to overthrow the monarchy. And Hassan al-Banna, who was essentially the founder, the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood, allied with Nasser and the officers who overthrew Farouk. But then, a few years later, he was then their enemy and ultimately died in prison. And so that relationship we've seen play out in Egypt, and we've seen it play out in the region. One of the, you know that I'm the dean of the communications school and college, and I suppose I should know whether it's a school or a college. Huh? And media is certainly at the heart of what I look at, and one of the things I look at is the role of media in shaping opinion and politics and policy in the Arab world and the broader Muslim world. And we saw with the founding of Al Jazeera in 1995, 1996, it created a whole new ethos in the Arab world over the following decade, where this division between the nationalists and the Islamists at some degree was papered over, as they all saw through the prism of pan-Arab media and semi-independent media, all saw common enemies in the authoritarian rulers across the region, whether that was Mubarak or whether that was Gaddafi or whether that was the emirs down in the Gulf. They had common cause, and they had, my most recent book is a lot about this, they had this common viewpoint, common worldview that was in part shaped by seeing the same things on TV. And that worldview ultimately came down to, we all oppose these guys. And we're blurring the lines between Arab nationalism and Islamism for a little while. And we certainly saw, as we did surveys in Arab newsrooms, we saw that particularly on the pan-Arab news level, where those who represented the forces of nationalism and those who represented the forces of Islamism had a real common viewpoint on big issues in the region. And so they all came together, of course, ultimately to overthrow Mubarak. But now, almost inevitably, they are again at loggerheads. In part because, of course, the Brotherhood may not be the evil incarnate that it is being painted by the guys in charge now, but they made huge mistakes as they came to power. And this is also a pattern that we see in the Arab world of when Islamist organizations, political movements, come to power, they then face all of those same issues that every politician has of, how do you fix the potholes in the street? How do you fix the economy, et cetera, et cetera? And when you're not schooled in and come out of a cultural milieu where you're preparing to deal with practical issues, you tend to overstep, and that's certainly what happened with the Brotherhood. But at a fundamental level, it also came down to an issue of worldview. The worldview of the Brotherhood and the worldview of the nationalists and the Mubarak elite and the secularists. In Egypt, it was natural that the Brotherhood was going to come to power when Mubarak was overthrown, because there really was no alternative. Though we saw on TV all these young, idealistic, secular Egyptians out in the streets or organizing the things going on in the streets and being the voice of the opposition, the reality was that there was no organized opposition other than the Brotherhood. Mubarak, as many authoritarian rulers, systematically prevented the rise of any kind of an organized civil society. And what do I mean by that? I mean, women's groups, groups that are dedicated to the environment, all of this array of non-governmental organizations that is natural here in the US, it's natural in Europe, and it's natural in emerging democracies. Groups that are dedicated to issues and want to affect the political discourse. Well, in Mubarak's Egypt, as in many of these other authoritarian countries in the Arab world and beyond, the ruler doesn't want people affecting the political discourse. The ruler wants everyone doing what he or she says they should do. So Mubarak made it extremely difficult, not impossible, but extremely difficult to organize non-governmental organizations. They had to be licensed, they had to be vetted, where their money came from was carefully tracked. And one of the projects that the center that I ran, we created a website and hired some reporters to cover civil society in Egypt, because no newspaper was really covering civil society in any kind of an effective way. And then we organized gatherings of people from civil society groups to teach them how to communicate, how to deal with the media, and then did the same thing with Egyptian journalists to help them understand what civil society was, how these organizations worked, because for each of them, the other was the devil incarnate. For journalists, these civil society people were all on the take from Western powers. They were all in it just to get Western funding. Some of them were, certainly. But that was the only reason they were at it. And from the perspective of the civil society people, the journalists were all mouthpieces for the government, and they lied and cheated and stole, and they wanted nothing to do with each other. So we'd bring them together into rooms, and we found a couple of things. One was that the women who were working on female genital mutilation issues up in the Nile Delta didn't even know the women working on those issues in Upper Egypt existed. And so these groups that were working on the same issues had been kept completely separated by the system. And they started talking and discovering mutual issues, and then they started organizing amongst themselves. And then we got reporters in the room with civil society people, began to understand what they did, and then media news organizations started devoting full pages to weekly coverage of civil society. That was a drop in the bucket of this vast country with all of these disparate organizations. And that nascent civil society that, among other things, USAID, a branch of the US government, was funding, trying to build a civil society, that didn't have time to mature. So when the revolution happened, and that's a loaded term in this case, when the uprising happened, and Mubarak was overthrown by the fact that there were these millions of people in the streets, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, now we made way for forming a new government and having elections. Well, all those people in civil society, all those secular opposition people, and many of them are, and I'm pointing to the non-faculty and non-retirees here, all of them are your sort of age, young college graduates, young college students, most of whom had no jobs, most of whom were completely fed up with the system, had no real prospects. The economy's been in shambles for decades and controlled by an elite few. They had the juice and the digital knowledge and the political organization knowledge to start the ball rolling with the uprising through, and I can talk more about this later, but I think I've given talks here about the role of social media in feeding this uprising, and then the simultaneous role of satellite television, non-Egyptian for the most part, satellite television, in bringing what was happening to the masses. So they had the organizational skills to get all that going. But once Mubarak was gone, and suddenly we're going to fast track to an election, well, it's the old, we're all united against the common enemy, but once the common enemy is gone, we're all at each other's throats. And that's exactly what happened. So those of you who watched in any detail what was going on in Egypt, you know that all these secular opposition groups, none of them could agree on a single candidate or a single platform, a single set of issues, a single voice at the drafting of the new constitution. And so who was the organized opposition in Egypt? It was the organization that had been outlawed for decades, the Muslim Brotherhood. But they had this vast grassroots network, a political network, but more importantly, a grassroots social network, because they had been working kind of under the radar until basically the last election under Mubarak, or the one before that, where they were allowed to compete and got seats in parliament. But up until then, they were an illegal organization. Their leadership were constantly being arrested and thrown in prison. But yet they had this grassroots infrastructure where they're bringing the bread to the people who don't have bread, where they're providing medical services to the people who don't have medical services, where they're serving as the de facto local government. And this isn't just Egypt. I mean, this we see across the Muslim world, and this is where the power of these organizations that we generally call political Islam come from. Hezbollah, we all in the U.S. know Hezbollah as the terrorist organization behind the bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, et cetera, all of which I covered. But Hezbollah started as nothing more than an idea, quite literally that. When I was with CBS in the Middle East, in Beirut, we started hearing about Hezbollah. And so, being good journalists, we said, well, talked to Shiite friends and said, where are they? Where's their office? Who do I interview? And they said, no, it's more of a way of thinking than anything else. And it was a way of thinking that argued, that there shouldn't be a U.S. presence in Lebanon, but also, had to do with the roots of Islamic thought and the role of Islam in day-to-day life and in politics. And then it ultimately coalesced into an organization. But that militant unit, I'm not here to defend Hezbollah, please, anybody who's taking notes for the paper. I made them, I'll tangential, I made the mistake in one of these talks a couple of years ago. I was quoting Edward Said, who talked about the problem of how Western media and academics approach Islam. And Said said something to the effect of we report about what we do and what they are, this idea that there's something in the DNA of Muslims that makes them do certain things, while we may make mistakes, or he may go out and murder 12 people, but he doesn't represent all of us. And this kind of got chewed up and spat back out. As I was going to bed one night, I checked my phone, and there was a Google alert on my name, right, to see what people are writing about me. And it was the Evergreen article. And the lead, which was all I got, was, Americans are bad and Muslims do bad things, said Lawrence Pintak, dean of... So, slightly out of context, but...
Pintak defends Hezbollah.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's why I always, kind of add, please. But my point is that, not to defend Hezbollah, but the reality was that this militant unit within Hezbollah that carried out all of the terrorism, and you could argue who they were answering to, et cetera, but it was a small piece of Hezbollah. Hezbollah basically ran South Lebanon, to this day runs South Lebanon. They're now the most powerful political force in Lebanon. And they have that power because there was no government because of the wars, et cetera. There was no government in South Lebanon. And so Hezbollah set up, all of the social services, all of the infrastructure. They paid people whose families or husbands or sons had died in the wars. They had, the equivalent of soup kitchens. They had clinics. And you see this again and again. We see it in Pakistan. We see it in Indonesia. This is the power of these organizations. It doesn't mean that they're bad. Now, Egypt, we're going in a very bad direction. I'll come back to that in a minute. But they are what they are. They are civil society organizations that have filled in the gaps where governments do not tread. And that has given them their power. And that emphatically was what did and does give the Muslim Brotherhood its power in Egypt. So at the grassroots level, the Muslim Brotherhood is not seen, I'm generalizing here, has not been seen by the people, the masses, the Arab street, etc., as as the devil incarnate as it's being portrayed now, but it was an alternative when there was no other alternative. Now, in Egypt, you then layer on, it's a class issue as well, not that every poor person in Egypt supports the Muslim Brotherhood by any means, but a significant portion was benefiting from actions of the Brotherhood. Then you layer on these class differentials so that the Mubarak infrastructure was very much the Mubarak elite. And again, I'm generalizing, but the elite who had the money, who controlled the economy, who were the haves, were generally tended toward being political secularists. Not to say they weren't good Muslims, but political secularists. And then were obviously defensive of the situation. And so when the Brotherhood took power in the wake of Mubarak's overthrow, you can make a strong argument that their huge mistake was not taking power, or maybe it was in taking power because they couldn't handle it, but it was then trying to force their religio-political agenda on the country, or at least being perceived as doing that, and being perceived as trying to silence media opponents. And lots of people were jailed, journalists. I'm on the Freedom House committee that does the Freedom of the Press report for the Middle East, and the numbers of journalists who were detained, beaten up, beaten to a pulp, a couple killed, many jailed, and then other political opponents who the same thing happened with, was huge. Now, Mubarak was no saint, and it was pretty miserable under Mubarak, but it had, for the media and the political opposition, it had loosened up in the last few years. Now, of course, it's even worse. Under these new guys, the number of journalists jailed, opposition figures detained, is quantitatively higher than it was even under Morsi in this short period. So it ain't a good picture. But the bottom line is that it ain't a good picture because there was no natural heir to Mubarak, H-E-I-R. No organization that could be a third force. You had the Mubarak elite, the old guard Mubarak people, you had the Brotherhood, and there was no third force that could effectively compete in that election, in that first election. So it came down to a choice between who? Between the Brotherhood and an old Mubarak loyalist. And so the secular opposition, one could argue pretty naively, voted for the Brotherhood. Most of them, again, I'm generalizing, obviously, because they didn't want to continue the Mubarak regime, essentially, the old ways. And then as soon as Morsi started moving in a direction they didn't like, they turned on him. And if you talk to, and some of our Egyptian friends in the audience may want to chime in later, but you talk to people in the secular opposition now to Morsi, and I see this in the media, friends of mine, former students of mine, who were schooled in balance and fairness, et cetera, and played a phenomenal role in professionalizing the Egyptian media over the last decade, and played an important role in the uprising, have not all gone jingoistic now. The vitriol that is being spouted by the non-Brotherhood media in Egypt is just appalling. And so that's fomenting this atmosphere of hatred. And what happened the other day that was kind of emblematic of where we're going to go? Anybody? An assassination attempt on the interior minister. A car bomb outside his home as he pulled up. He wasn't killed, but a couple of his bodyguards were. And even he said, this is the beginning. And he said it because he's interior minister. He wants to be able to crack down even more. But, this is unfortunately what happens when you marginalize groups from the political process. And that's doubly true when you're talking about groups that represent political Islam, because the Brotherhood pretty effectively had brought under its wing groups that had been, or at least allied with itself, groups that had been using violence a couple of decades ago, but had now been brought into the system. Now that the Brotherhood's leadership has been decimated, the Brotherhood is completely forced out of the system and will not be coming back into the system anytime soon. Now, those extreme edges of that alliance say, see, I told you, and they spin back off and start creating acts of violence, which creates that whole cycle. And Egypt is important for a number of reasons, not least because what has happened in Egypt, and has happened in a few other places in the Arab world now, in terms of marginalizing political forces of political Islam from the process, means that those within that milieu who have always argued that they won't allow us, democracy is a mirage, because as soon as we win, they're going to undercut the pillars of democracy. They can now say, see, we were right. And we saw the beginnings of this, whatever it was, a decade ago or a little less than a decade ago, when under, and again, I'm not taking political positions here, but under the Bush administration, when we were talking about we want democracy in the Arab world. And then two things happened. There were two elections. Hamas was elected in Palestine, and a significant block of seats, I forget what the number was at this point, but a significant block of people who represented the Brotherhood were elected to the Egyptian parliament. And we immediately cut off all contact with Hamas and with the Gaza Strip, and we immediately said we're not talking to the Brotherhood. So even though you had Brotherhood people sitting in the Egyptian parliament, our official policy was we wouldn't talk to them. And so that was the beginning of sending this message that, democracy is great as long as the right people are elected. And so, that's essentially where we are now. Meanwhile, of course, we won't get into U.S. policy on Syria at the moment, but in Egypt, U.S. has been in a complete and utter no-win situation, because the Obama administration took the heat for not, quote, forcing Mubarak to step down. And this is presuming that we were in a position to force him to step down. There's a strong argument that the more U.S. pressure, the more he would dig in, right? And then we started taking heat from the secularists for our relationship with the Morsi government. Now, we're being criticized for having a government-to-government relationship with a government that has been democratically elected. And then as Morsi, went kind of off the rails, and the opposition to him grew, the criticism of our relationship, our continued dialogue with that government, ratcheted up. And then when he was finally forced to step down, we took all sorts of heat and continue to. Emblematic of what I'm talking about with the media, jingoism of the media, a very good, very old friend of mine who I've always highly respected as a journalist, was chief investigative correspondent for Al Jazeera, and then played an important role in the rise of independent media in Egypt. There was a false story in an obscure left-wing website in the Netherlands or Germany, saying that the outgoing U.S. ambassador to Syria, Roberts, who is the incoming ambassador to Egypt, this story said that he had hired hit squads. He had a private militia in Syria and had hired hit squads. Obviously, this is a completely bogus story. But this friend of mine, who is probably the leading current affairs talk show host in Egypt now, and has hundreds of thousands of followers on his Twitter feed, tweeted the story saying, "See what we're in for when Roberts arrives." I mean, that's the level of jingoism and just vile attitudes in the Egyptian media that is helping to feed all of this. So the bottom line is that we're looking at what I think will be a really nasty period of serious instability in Egypt, if not a whole wave of overt terrorism, which is what I think will probably happen. And there is no right policy for the U.S. in this situation. Those of you who have been following Egypt, know that Washington jumped through hoops and twisted itself into pretzels, trying to avoid using the word coup for the military takeover. Obviously, and go on the record on this one, it was a coup. When the military takes over and jails the president, that's pretty much the definition of a coup. But because it would have meant an immediate secession or cutoff of U.S. aid to Egypt, they jumped through hoops not to do that. But the reality is, now we're threatening, we cut off aid, et cetera, to try to force the government to moderate, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is it doesn't matter, because our aid, our allies in the Gulf, in the Emirates, have already checkmated us on this. There's a very good piece, I think it was the Times, I don't remember, a couple of weeks ago, about the machinations that went on behind the scenes with the U.S. lobbying our allies in the United Arab Emirates to have a lot of influence with the current military regime to try to moderate things. And this was specifically on the eve of that horrendous massacre 2 or 3 weeks ago, when they went in and cleaned out the camps, trying to get them to not go in, to give it more time, etc. And the Emirati foreign minister said, yeah, sure, I'll go tell them that. And he went in and he told them, if the U.S. pulls its aid, don't worry about it, we'll match it 3 times over. So any leverage the U.S. had with our aid, and really we never had that much leverage because it wasn't that much money at the end of the day, was completely undercut. So we have no juice in Egypt, just as we have no juice in Syria. And the reality is that we have very little juice anywhere in the Arab world right now. And that has, to slip into Syria, that has been further exacerbated by the long, painful ballet around whether or not we're going to strike in Syria. And I'm not advocating for a strike, but the fact that we set the red line and then didn't immediately act, and then adding insult to injury in the eyes of those in the Arab world who want the U.S. to do something, or even have any respect for the U.S., then we turned around and went to Congress and said, what do you think? And so Obama is being widely perceived in the Arab world as being weak and as being ineffective. And while there certainly is huge mixed emotions around the idea of any U.S. intervention in another Arab country, there's also a huge level of hatred of what Assad is doing on the ground among average Arabs. So you see 2 very different dialogues going on in the Arab world right now. One of them in the official media, and we're very much back to a place where most media in the Arab world have retreated back into partisan camps and are either voices of the particular regimes or, as in Egypt, voices of opposition and vitriol. But we don't see the kind of dialogue that we were seeing just a couple of years ago. But where you do see it, and there's a fascinating new study coming out, where you do see it is in social media. There's a complete disconnect, not surprisingly, but now we have the ability to document this, complete disconnect between what the official media are saying in the countries that oppose Assad, and that basically boils down to most of the Sunni Muslim Arab world, except Lebanon, and what you see on Twitter. So Mark, take a look, there's a brief piece on this on foreignpolicy.com. Mark Lynch at George Washington and a couple of other people are just about to publish a study looking at, I forget the number, some staggering hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tweets in the Arab world, analyzing the discourse and seeing how, A, it's for the most part very different than the official media, but B, it's exactly the same phenomena that we see here in the US, where because of cable television, media fragmentation, we all turn to those media that support our preconceived notions. We all, of course, I'm generalizing. And in the Arab world now, you see that happening on Twitter. So the Twitter streams and the retweets, et cetera, fall into particular camps with relatively little overlap between those camps. It's a clear polarization in the body politic, as we have that polarization, media-driven polarization here. So I'll stop pontificating and take questions and complaints.
So it sounds to me like you're sort of saying, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, the U.S. So what could the U.S. do over the next 2 or 3 years to not create or contribute to a bigger mess in the Middle East and not further erode what minimal respect may still exist?
Luckily, I'm not in the State Department. It is very hard to see an overarching long-term or mid-term strategy in the Arab world. Egypt, you're not going to have overt influence in. In Egypt, you can work behind the scenes to support some factions, some voices of reason. Mohammed al-Baradei will probably run in this next, assuming there is another presidential election, will probably run, and one can only hope that a segment of the secular opposition will coalesce around him. He, of course, is the Nobel Prize winning former head of the Atomic Energy Commission, is that right? And was a part of this government, this current Sisi military government, until about 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, when the big massacre occurred, and he finally stepped down saying, my voice isn't being heard. And emblematic of what's going on in Egypt right now, individuals can file criminal suits against people in Egypt. It's really weird. And someone filed suit against him for treason, for abandoning the government. So he's sitting back in Germany, I think is where his home is. But he'll likely run. So, there are elements within the secular opposition you can quietly support through USAID funds, et cetera. But even that's very dangerous for them now because of the way they're tracking foreign money and foreign involvement. You can kind of quietly sit back and have a dialogue, but you're not going to have an overt involvement. And then, Syria is just off the charts complicated at this point. In the back?
You make a very convincing case for the continued instability within Egypt. Can you speak to the role or the future role of the Egyptian military as we continue to back them financially, billions of dollars?
Well, right. I mean, it goes back to this question of pulling out our aid. So on one hand, pulling aid won't actually do much because that'll be backfilled by others. And in the greater scheme of things, it doesn't have that big an effect. But there is the symbolic issue, coming back to the lady's question in the back, the symbolic issue of saying, all right, we're just not going to in any way, shape, or form support this government anymore. The problem with the whole landscape of using aid as a weapon, I had a conversation with a young, he's not that young actually, a reporter who's in the investigative unit at UC Berkeley, and he's like a 35-year-old Egyptian, just coincidentally, reporter. He's a fellow there. He called me the other day, and I'm telling you this long story because it really does epitomize the problem here. He called me because he's doing a story. He discovered that one of the U.S. government aid programs called MEPI, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, had funded a newspaper Yom Saba, for those of you who are Egyptian, in Egypt. And he was pretty apoplectic about this. They'd given them, I don't know, $150,000 or something in 2011 to create a video unit. And his argument was, Yom Saba was the paper that first broke the story about, remember the I'm going to forget the name of it, the something of Muhammad, the pseudo movie.
It was a YouTube video.
Yeah, what was the name of it? Anyway, this YouTube video, 18-minute segment that was just, horrendously just insulting, etc., and offensive. His argument was, and I don't know whether this is true, I haven't tracked it back, that they were the ones who first broke this story, and they were really anti-American in their coverage of this, and they really riled people up. And so, he was apoplectic about this idea, how could the U.S. government be funding this newspaper? How could they have not pulled their aid? And is this what U.S. government aid is supposed to be doing? And on and on and on and on. And aside from explaining to him that, the whole idea of being a journalist is that you don't come in with an agenda and you don't, get all riled up and start spitting and fuming. The reality is, what would the headline have been if the U.S. government, as part of an effort to foster the ideals of free speech and free media, had immediately gone in and pulled the remaining funds from this project because the paper had written something they didn't like? I mean, can you imagine the headlines then? And so, that's the problem with all U.S. government funds. Not all of it's effective. General Sisi was at the U.S. Army War College, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and wrote a paper about the need for Arab democracy. So go figure, it doesn't all work. Yeah.
There's a population in Egypt throughout all of this of Coptic Orthodox Christians who, in the past 24 months especially, but throughout a long history, have been somewhat victimized and or persecuted. And recently, in the past month even, there was a bombing of 25 churches outside of Luxor, etc. And all of these just kind of negative things happening, whether it be people part of the Muslim Brotherhood, people affiliated or not. I don't really necessarily think that's important. What I do think is important is that a lot of those things aren't really being brought up, surfaced in the media. On our part, our meaning Western media, I have to go to Al Jazeera or sources in the country to actually hear more logistics, more details, etc. As someone working in the media, I'm curious to what your thought and opinion on the kind of silence of Coptic Orthodox Christians is.
Well, you mean media silence about?
Yeah, media silence about.
I'm not sure I agree with you completely.
Okay.
And yes, there is a lot less coverage, but I think part of it is that as horrendous as the attacks on churches and Coptic Christians, et cetera, has been, it really has been a subset of the violence. Mm-hmm. And so it's been overshadowed by all of the other violence, and kind of blended in. First of all, we as Americans have a very low threshold for interest in anything overseas, unfortunately, and for violence, violence all starts to look the same, and we tune out mentally, physically, whatever. So I think there's a part of that. There's been obviously violence against the Copts for quite some time under Mubarak, et cetera, and there was a fair amount of reporting about that there relative to overall reporting about Egypt about that. And I think it's also complicated by, I'm not taking a political position here, but I don't think the Copts have done themselves any favors either by having the Coptic Pope stand up there with Sisi when he took over the government. That sent a real message to the Brotherhood and its supporters. I happen to get, it seems like thrice daily emails from some Coptic organization, I forget, Egyptian Coptic organization, it is just vitriolic. So, there are extremists on both ends. But I think, to the core of your question, I think it's just a matter of the media. There's a limited window for coverage of Egypt in the American media, and that, ebbs and flows depending on the level of violence. And within that window, there's a subset that's Coptic. So at the end of the day, or violence against Copts, at the end of the day, it starts getting pretty small.
So I want you to take off your journalism hat and be a historian for a minute and take a long-term perspective. And I want to come back to your point that for democracy to work, you have to have a robust civil society, you have to have democratic, non-governmental organizations and institutions that function. And I wonder if there's anything unique about the Middle East or the Islamic world in particular that is problematic in this respect. Because building those and building a civil society and a democratic state is a tough process. I mean, you know, the French Revolution wasn't all that smooth. And
Hey,
we had
look-
lots of problems after the American.
Look at Zimbabwe.
Oh yeah. So you know, the American Revolution, we had fought a bloody
Yeah.
civil war. You know, almost a century later. So this is a tough process, and I'm wondering if that's all we're witnessing right now in the Middle East, is this tough process playing itself out, or if there's something more unique going on.
Oh, I think there is something more unique. I mean, yeah, fundamentally there is that problem. I mean, I covered Rhodesian independence, and I have on my wall in my office an interview I did with Mugabe a couple of years before independence, in which for Newsweek, which he's saying, oh, you know, we're not going to make the same mistakes as the rest of Black Africa. No, we're going to do them in spades, right? So there's that fundamental thing of building civil society in a non-democratic society. But you know, the historian hat, you look at not just the Arab world but the broader Muslim world. You know, there is, and I'm talking deep history, the continued relationship, sometimes troubled, sometimes allied, between the political forces and the forces of religion. And of course, you know, this is the fundamental schism within Islam, is between the Shia and the Sunni. And what's the core? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but you know, the core is who is going to be the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Is this now going to be a political thing, an elected political thing, or is this going to be the bloodline? And is this, and then ultimately it gets also into, you know, is the caliph going to be the political ruler and the religious ruler, or are we going to divide those two things out? And so there's always been this troubled relationship between politics, in broad strokes, and religion in the Muslim world, and particularly, I would argue, the Arab world, because there's a lot of other factors that come into play when you move out to Pakistan or Indonesia, etc. But by the same token, you know, I also covered the Indonesian Revolution in the late 90s, and Indonesia has come through this very, very well. Arguably, there was a bit more of a civil society in Indonesia than there was in Egypt, for example. But the forces of political Islam were more, and this is a cultural thing, more moderate, and I use that term carefully, in that Indonesia, not to do a whole seminar in Indonesia, but Indonesia is a very inclusive, very consensus-oriented society, and Islam in Indonesia is heavily influenced by both the historic issues of Buddhism and local animist beliefs. So it's again, I don't want to make this sound wrong, but a gentler approach. And again, I'll epitomize this by, on one of my first trips to Indonesia, after many years in the Arab world, it would happen to be during Ramadan, the month of fasting. And in the Arab world, I mean, you don't, you know, go into a restaurant and you don't eat in front of somebody who's fasting. You don't walk down the street eating or drinking, et cetera, et cetera. So you're very sensitive to this. In Indonesia, this guy had said, meet me in the coffee shop at the Hilton. And I thought, that's strange. You know, I'm pretty sure he's Muslim. And it's lunchtime, and it's Ramadan. And so I waited for him at the coffee shop, and I was a little earlier than he was, and he came in and he said, oh, haven't you ordered? And I said, well, no. You know, I'm not trying to put you in a position on the spot here if you aren't fasting, but I assume you're fasting. So yeah, I'm fasting, but please go ahead and order and, you know, eat. Don't worry about it. Now I didn't, but you would, to generalize, you would never have that conversation in the Arab world. So I think that more kind of inclusive approach, less pushing a political religio agenda, means that it was easier for Indonesia to make this transition and for the forces of political Islam to be included in the system, And so after the elections, they didn't make it on the national level, but the first mayor of Jakarta was from the political Islam party, the Freedom and Justice Party, I think is what it was called. And he did not push an Islamist agenda, unlike what Morsi's done. So I think there is a cultural aspect to this that is different in every world. But, you know, some of those issues are true everywhere.
Time for one
Yeah, sure. Oh, I'm sorry, that you were asking a question. Yes, go, please.
For giving us a chance to know your opinion about that. As an Egyptian, I have two comments about you to speak. The first comment, the crisis we have now in Egypt is not between Muslim Brotherhood and military. No, it's between whoever gonna support the democracy in Egypt and the military. Not Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, most of them in jail. We still see every day people in the street. So it's all about democracy in Egypt and coup in Egypt, military coup in Egypt. So this is the first comment I have. It's not Muslim Brotherhood and military. The second comment I have, when you said during President Morsi time, you see some people in media in jail. I never hear about that. Percentage-wise, I'm in engineering, so percentage-wise, if you see what percent, maybe true, I don't know, but percentage-wise, how many media leader now in jail compared to if we have anyone in Morsi time, which is 1 year, I believe it's 99 to 1. I don't know if you agree on that or not.
I think your
We
number,
have-
in principle, as I said earlier, there are a lot more, given the time period you're
Yeah.
talking about, a lot more proportionately in jail under this regime, but there were also a lot under Morsi.
During Morsi time, he never closed any channel, no matter what the channel is to, you know. We even been criticizing him, you know. This channel is just telling lies, you know.
Well, I'll
I
send
don't
you
know that.
the Freedom of the Press report.
Yeah, but he didn't close any channels.
Okay.
You know, during that time, day one.
Oh, yeah, they've closed a
no,
lot of channels, sure.
Yeah, day -1, you know, they put.
But it shouldn't be a conversation about who's worse. You know, the goal here is to look for a government that is better, right? Not who's worse.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm not saying. I'm just saying this is as an Egyptian, this is what I'm seeing in the media. You know? I mean, again, whatever we have right now is not Muslim Brotherhood against military coup. No, I believe. I mean, everyone seeing any hope for a democracy, they're gonna be against the military. As an Egyptian myself, I didn't see any hope if that military is still there. No matter, you know, we still have some hope. If Muslim Brotherhood is there, we may have some hope to have a democracy. I'm not saying Muslim Brotherhood is perfect, no, but we may have some hope. 20%, 30%, we can negotiate that. We can discuss that. But with the military, it's zero. You know, there is no way. You are assuming that Mohammed al-Brady is going to be the next president, and I'm telling you.
Oh, I'm not assuming. No.
No, I mean.
I'm not assuming there's going to be an election.
And then you mention it, I'm telling you, the next president, this is my opinion, coming from the military.
That historically, of course, is all Egyptian presidents have been from the military, quite literally. You want to wrap
Unfortunately, I
up?
think our time is
All right.
up. Before I ask you to join us, thanking our guests, for those of you who may be here for a class, there'll be some sign-up sheets in the front lobby here. And now, I still didn't hear whether or not it was the Muslim Brotherhood who attacked us on 9/11, but I'll let you go without answering that. Now, please join me in thanking Larry Pintak for a really